Hello and welcome to the first of our end-of-week summary films for William Wordsworth Poetry, People and Place. I'm Simon Bainbridge and I'm the lead educator for the course, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Jeff Cowton, another of the course's educators, who is of course curator for the Wordsworth Trust. This is the first of a number of these weekly films that we'll make, which give us a chance to respond to your comments and pick up on larger issues, and sometimes try and add a little bit extra to the course itself, which is what we're seeking to do today. I think first of all of us on the team want to thank you very much for your comments and for your commitment to the course. We've been absolutely delighted with the feedback that we've been receiving, with the questions that you've been asking, with the discussions that you've had, and also with the way in which you're supporting each other in your learning. We have a really strong sense of a growing community of Wordsworthians out there. Ideally, for a film like this, Jeff and myself would be in the same place, but obviously you'll understand due to the current circumstances, we're filming from different locations. In my case, a rather mundane one. In Jeff's case, a very special one, which he'll introduce in just a second. So Jeff, hello, thank you very much for your involvement in the course. Perhaps you could begin by telling us exactly where you are.
Well, I am in a special place. I'm in the sitting room in the Cottage. If you know the house, if you've seen part of it perhaps on the book already, you will know that it's not a large house. This is perhaps the grandest room in it. It's certainly the lightest room in it, and it was the sitting room that Thomas de Quincey said was the nearest that Wordsworth came to a study. And so it's in this room that they would have read, they would have written, but it's also where they would have breakfasted, and it's also a room we know that Coleridge slept in on many occasions. And typical of the rooms in Dove Cottage, it was very fluid in its use in the 8 years that they stayed here, but almost on a daily or a weekly basis. So it is, yes, it's a very special room.
Well, it's fantastically exciting to have you broadcasting to us from that room, and we'll talk in just a moment maybe about some of the things that might even have been written in that room. But I'm aware that Dove Cottage has now reopened to the public following the shutdown. But even more than that, I mean, you're now representing Dove Cottage to the public in a very new way as part of your Reimagining Wordsworth project. So perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about that, please.
So again, if you've visited Dove Cottage in the past, you will have seen a very beautiful house, beautifully looked after, but set up for visits of groups of maybe 15 people, and the interpretation would have been by a guided tour. And whilst that is very popular, it's not for everyone. It's not essentially good for access for everyone. And what we wanted to do was for Dove Cottage, to do the interpretation, to tell the story that could only be told in Dove Cottage. So we've begun by introducing the story, the background, the context, the characters, the events that took place here, in a film that you see in one of the parts of the cottage, in what was once a stable. And then having seen the cottage, the film, you will then come into the house, and it's almost like stepping into the stage set that you've seen in the film. So you will then be free to explore. Because of the current pandemic, we're having to restrict numbers and restrict timings, but what we would hope is that you would feel very much at home. And we will welcome you as a guest to this home, so that if you wish to sit and just absorb the place for 20 minutes, that's perfectly good. If there are questions that come to mind, then we have guides at hand to help to answer and explore further. But the idea really is that it's more of a home than it is of a museum, and that you get a sense of what it was like to live in it.
Fantastic. Well, I, for one, am very excited about the possibility of seeing it for the first time, since it is being represented in that way. It sounds absolutely fascinating. And I know that those people I know who have seen it have been bowled over by it and by that sense of atmosphere you're describing, and that sense that William may just have stepped out of the door at the moment at which you walk in. Obviously, the opening of the cottage has also been part of what's a very important year for Wordsworth, this being the 250th anniversary of his birth. And I know another part of the project has been the recreation of the museum that's dedicated to Wordsworth. As a result of the lockdown, I think that's probably now going to open early next year. But I just wonder if you might say a bit, people have been very interested in the course around the conservation of the manuscripts and how you present Wordsworth to your visiting public. I wonder if you might just say about, you know, how the new museum is going to work, what key messages you're trying to get across there about William, and, you know, what uses you're making of the manuscripts.
Well, the visit, when it's available in full, early next year, as you say, what we would like to do is to enable people to step out of the busy world of today. Wordsworth was all for taking time, for taking meditative moments in nature. Well, we're inviting visitors to take time out of the busy world, stepping back in time into Dove Cottage, into the garden, and seeing, perhaps, and feeling how the poetry came about. You might then say, well, okay, that's very interesting, that's good to know, that's very enjoyable, but you might then ask your question, well, so what? What's its value to us today? And so the new museum will begin with that very question. And in working with Simon, working with you, we have put together 3 sort of key ideas. One being that Wordsworth wishes us to live closer with nature. The second one is that Wordsworth wishes us to develop a greater empathy for others. And the third is that he would wish us to develop our own creative imagination. And so the story through the museum is always coming back to those three points. What is the value today? And there'll be a number of, as well as manuscripts, books, pictures, as you would expect, there will be a number of short audio pieces and video pieces in which people from all backgrounds say what these poems and the lives of Wordsworth mean to them as individuals. And in terms of the manuscripts, the Trust has 23 of the 24 surviving manuscripts of the Prelude, and we think there's an opportunity here to tell the story of how the poems were created. So there will be a chronology, a timeline illustrated with manuscripts of the writing of that poem that Wordsworth started and returned to over a period of 40 years. So we hope that, as well as showing the meanings of the writing and the beauty of the writing, we'll be better able to examine how the writing came about. Fantastic. So there's very strong links with the course that people are taking at the moment, isn't there? Just think about those key themes, nature, the importance of other humans, the power of the creative imagination. You know, those are themes that people are already picking up on very powerfully in the course. So the museum will give a chance to explore those further if people are lucky enough to visit it. And then obviously the whole notion of the creative process, the imagination, and the many manuscripts of the Prelude, that's something we'll be looking at next week on the course. So people have a sense of just how wonderful the collection is there, I think, and they'll get a sense of how much that tells us about the writing process itself. I think one of the pleasures of the project, Simon, if I may, is to say that it's been a real pleasure working with you and with Sally, as well as Stephen Gill, on that exhibit, and I think it's going to be wonderful. It's going to look stunning, and I can't think of anywhere else where you can see the creative minds of William working with Dorothy, with Mary, with Coleridge, that produced that incredible work. Well, I mean, that is one of the great things, isn't it, about the site that you're speaking to us from. I mean, this is the place where Wordsworth wrote his poetry, you know, about the exact the precise location, and where the manuscripts still are. I mean, you mentioned working there with Dorothy and Mary, and you know, perhaps you could say a bit more about that, because that's something that people taking the course have been very interested in. I think this sense of the other people who were part of the creative process and the actual production of the poetry through the work they did, transcribing, copying out, maybe even it's a form of collaboration too. And my sense is that it may be in that very room that you're speaking to us from that some of this work went on. So the composition, we know, would take place mainly outside with Wordsworth walking. But if you like, the transfer from, I guess, from Wordsworth's imagination onto the physical form of paper, we imagine did take place largely in this room. So we've kind of tried to imagine the scene. Dorothy talks about a small green table. She talks about a writing table, and it was round. So we have a round table. And Stephen Gill talks about, doesn't he? He talks about the poetry factory. It was a place where the physical writing, the manuscripts was produced. And in the room with us now, I have to say these are all facsimiles. We have a moment, because Dove Cottage interpretation tries to pick specific moments. So as Wordsworth tells us in Simon Lee, that there is a tale in everything. And the way we've approached it is to pick specific moments and tell the tales behind them. So on the table, we have what the Wordsworth family referred to. It's a facsimile, I keep saying this, it's a facsimile of a Calais notebook, a little notebook that William and Dorothy purchased when they visited Annette in the summer of 1802. And they bought, I think it was 4 of these little notebooks, 5 maybe. And this is what Wordsworth used for the drafting of his poetry when writing the Prelude in early 1804. So Coleridge, suffering heavily from opium addiction, decides to go to Malta in search of better health. But before he goes, he says to Wordsworth that he would like a copy of every unpublished poem that he could take on the journey with him. So this starts off a very intense period of William, Dorothy, Mary, writing poems, bringing poems together that already existed. And one of these poems, of course, is the Prelude. So Wordsworth sets about fresh composition, and you won't be able to see it from a distance, but these are the sort of the typical drafting of manuscript. So we can imagine round this table, perhaps, William directing, taking several notebooks at once, pointing to lines that he'd like copied, sorting out the order in which they should be copied out, and then Mary and Dorothy writing it out for him. And the result was about 200 sheets, just this size. This is the exact size, written out with a quill, homemade ink, of beautiful handwriting of Wordsworth's unpublished poems by this time. There's about 400 pages altogether, 200 leaves. And what they feared was that Coleridge would lose the manuscript, having given him this great manuscript to take away to Malta. They feared that he would lose it. But then they also feared that if he did lose it, could Wordsworth actually do this again? Did he have the energy? Could he bring all these manuscripts together into this, if you like, this neat form? And so what did they do? Well, they copied it all out a second time. So you can imagine in a very intense period in sort of February, March, April of 1804, where this great collaboration of William, Dorothy, Mary, written for Coleridge, of course, the inspiration behind the poem, all took place. So it's kind of remarkable to think about that moment in this very room where I'm sitting now.
Yeah, that's an incredible story, and as you say, it must be a very atmospheric place to be, to realise that process has happened there. Yeah.
And it's sort of darkish, isn't it? Even though this is a summer's day, and I know it's early evening when we're talking, but you know, in a February, March day, they must have had candles. They must have relied on firelight. You know, was it a warm room? You know, what was it like? There's still a lot to our imagination to think about how it came about.
And I think when people look at the films for next week, where we talk in more detail about the Prelude, and we're able to provide close-ups and so on of these materials, they'll get a sense of just how exquisite and beautiful these are as written objects. And as you say, the idea of producing those in the dark, smoke-filled, sometimes rather gloomy atmosphere of the cottage is quite extraordinary. I know as well that people are very interested in Dorothy and Dorothy's role in the creation of work, and in Dorothy as a writer herself. I'm not going to talk about that in detail now, because we devote much of week 4 to that and raise those issues very much then. But we'll be back in Dove Cottage in week 4 to think particularly about Dorothy. I wonder if I might quickly ask you about another woman in William's life who's been the cause of much interest in the comments on the MOOC, which is Annette Vallon. Obviously Wordsworth's lover when he was in France, and the mother to his child. We sort of tell the story in the introduction quite briefly, So there's no need for us to retell the whole story here. I just wondered if you had any reflections on the nature of that that relationship, Jeff, or you know, how it develops, what happens sort of after 1802, when we know that William and Dorothy visit Annette and Caroline to tell them that William is about to marry Mary.
We can only speculate, can't we, on what must have been going through everyone's mind at that point. Mary in Yorkshire at this point, William and Dorothy going over to France to see Annette. The remarkable thing, isn't it, too, that this was kept so much within the family and the circle, so that when William died and the memoirs were written, that William's own children still didn't know that they had a relative in France. It's kind of remarkable how these things happen, and I guess they do happen in families. We know that William's daughter married. She was due to be married in 1815. Dorothy was going to represent the Wordsworth family in France at the wedding. It was called off because Napoleon returned to France and the war recommenced. She did marry the next year. She had a daughter. In 1820, so that's 4 years later, the Wordsworth family visited Paris. They spent time, William and Dorothy spent time with Annette. I think Mary less so. And then from the marriage onwards, Wordsworth supported Caroline to the tune, I think, of about £35 a year, and that carried on for the next 20 years. And at which point he then gave a lump sum of £400 to, if you like, to end that sort of arrangement. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine what it must have been like for William to leave France, having not, before Caroline was born, and to having to go 10 years without seeing his daughter.
Yes, I mean, it's very interesting to just that sense of a sort of secret history that in some way underpins a lot of the emotions and a lot of the writing, both you know, in the household and in the poetry itself.
Yeah.
I wonder if there have been so many areas that I could ask you about that people have engaged with on the course, but I particularly wanted to get your sense of two particular areas, Jeff, before we finish. One of which is people have been very interested in the notion of Wordsworth as somebody who chooses low and rustic subjects and who chooses to write using the language used by men. And there's been some very interesting discussion on the MOOC in relation to how to view this. You know, some people have been arguing that actually, you know, this is a kind of slightly patronising position to take from a, you know, a middle class writer in relation to the rural poor. Other people have seen this as a much more democratic process. I mean, personally, I mean, my own feelings are, yeah, that we can very much see the legacy of Wordsworth's own engagement with the French Revolution here, that we know he was for a period a passionate supporter of the revolution. Of course, over the course of 20 years, his views changed quite radically, partly due to the war and so on. But for me, in the 1790s, he's still very much a radical thinker. I think when you open his early poetry and you have these poems which are on the figures who are very much at the margins of society, you know, we've got beggars, we've got children with special needs, we've got unmarried mothers, we've got war widows, we've got the rural poor. I mean, it does feel to me that these are very kind of sympathetic accounts of those figures. But I wondered, you know, thinking about that issue from Dove Cottage, I mean, some of our participants may well have done another very interesting MOOC, which is on the English country house, the literature of the English country house. I think for me, one of the things that's always very striking when you come to Dove Cottage is actually it's a very humble, modest abode, really. So I just wonder if you could tell us something about the sort of the everyday life of the Wordsworths, and if that helps us in thinking about William's attitude to the figures that he writes about and to the language that he uses.
Well, it's the, as you rightly say, it's the location of the house, isn't it? It's built on what was then the main road through the Central Lake District. So it was connecting what was then a thriving port Whitehaven, with Kendal and all points in between, and the wagons went by regularly. And you know, we may think, well, what have they got to complain about? But the Wordsworths did say that the traffic was so great, or the use of the road was so great, that they had to build a wall in front of the house, as they said, to make the house more our own. And they said that this wasn't a good house to be in if you were poorly, because the noise travelled. So there must have been a good number of people using it. And we know from Dorothy's journal that these were people very often in need. A number of them knock at the door. A number of them are soldiers from the war, or sailors from the war. There are widows. There are the very characters that Wordsworth writes about in the lyrical ballads, to which you've been saying. And in the prelude, where he talks about the public roads were schools to me, their soul into the depths of human souls. So Wordsworth, unusually from his status in life, walked the roads with Dorothy, of course, and they would meet and talk. And Dorothy's journals, as we know, are full of recordings of these conversations. With, I think someone worked out that there are 43 unnamed people in Dorothy's journals with whom they have conversation. So there could be beggars, or the woman from Hawkshead, or the girl from Coniston. And the last point I would just say is, in the new museum, you might remember, where we looked at the letter that Wordsworth wrote to John Wilson in 1802, who said, didn't he, that these were not fit subjects for poetry. What pleasure would you get? Well, Wordsworth said in return, it's because you have a lack of comprehensiveness of thinking and feeling. And Wordsworth, in this letter, saying, that anybody like himself who had spent time with people, however we want to call it, the labouring classes, if you like, the working classes, the rural working population, anybody who, like him, had spent time with these people would know, to give them an empathetic and a sympathetic ear. So I think that suggests that he wasn't just observant, but that he really was part of their lives.
Thank you, Jeff. That's great. And your mention of John Wilson's letter just reminds me of the sense of how, for people living at the time of Wordsworth, just how new and startling this poetry was. I mean, I think this is one of the things Wordsworth has been so influential that we often forget, actually, that in some ways he invented what we now think of as modern poetry. One final question.
I was just going to add, wasn't it, that it's worth remembering too, isn't it, that they weren't just subjects of poetry as poetry, that he was writing on their behalf, and how the lyrical ballads of 1800 was sent to influential people like the leader of the opposition, Charles James Fox, so that they would recognise that the people he was writing about were real people and not some sort of objectified group or mob that was to be feared and not given fair justice.
And we'll look at exactly that act of sending his poems to the leader of the opposition in week 3, when we look at Michael, who's a poem which really dramatises these issues. One final question, if I may, Jeff. Another area that participants have been very interested in is the notion of the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, which obviously is a sort of archetypal, if you like, romantic notion of poetry, that it's both spontaneous, but also that it's about feeling. It's not about reason, it's about emotion. But participants have also been very interested in the notion that it takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. So there's not just the initial feeling, but there's also this, what my colleague Sally Bushell referred to as this kind of layered element to the poetry. You've got both the first emotion, you've then got it being recollected, and then you've got the writing process as well, and sometimes the rewriting process. And I just wondered if you had a particular take on that that definition of poetry, and particularly that notion of the sort of the recollection in tranquility.
Well, when we've talked about this in the past, haven't we? We've thought this can sometimes be years later. If we think when we talk about the prelude manuscript, for example, being written 1804, 1805 about things that the climbing of Snowdon, for example, which is many years before, to I guess things like I Wandered Lonely, which you know, we know was inspired by a walk at Ullswater in 1802, but the poem was probably written 2 years later. Wordsworth saw the Leech Gather in 1800, but the poem Resolution and Independence, in which he features, comes 2 years later. There's even writing the poem about the beggars, where they saw the beggars locally. Dorothy writes about them in a journal. William writes the poem about that 2 years later. So that's not to say every poem had a 2-year gap. The only what I was sort of thinking that could possibly not be recollected in tranquility, or was a matter of hours rather than days or years, is the poem written actually on the day after they saw the daffodils, The Cock is Crowing, where they experience something by Broadwater, and William writes the poem, Brothers Water rather, and William writes the poem by 1 o'clock that day, between 1 and 2 o'clock that day, and Dorothy's journal then actually on that occasion follows the poem. It's usually the other way around, but it does seem it can be anything from, you know, from days to years to even a decade later, which is certainly recollecting tranquility at that point.
Well, if I might just pick up on a couple of those examples. I mean, as you know, I've been researching the literature of mountaineering in the period recently, and Wordsworth and Keats both make big climbs of British mountains. When Keats goes up Ben Nevis, he is absolutely determined he's going to write a poem about it, and he writes it on the summit. So there you've got the kind of an immediacy, a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. You mentioned Wordsworth going up Snowdon, which becomes the grand climax of the prelude. It takes him about 10 years, I think, to realise the significance of that, from when he first climbs it to when he starts writing about it. So very different models of romantic composition. But you also mentioned the daffodils there, and I can't just help wondering about the end of the daffodils, where there's that moment of recollection where he talks about lying on his pensive couch, and how the vision of the daffodils come back to him and dance on his inward eye, and that provides the bliss of solitude. And you're sitting there beside a pensive couch. Is that William's own pensive couch? I perhaps shouldn't ask this, but...
Well, this is where we give a nuanced answer, Simon, and we say, yes, it is. This is William's couch, and this is maybe where, you know, particularly at Rydal Mount, he may well have lain and reflected in that bliss. Whether this is the couch in which he sat in Dove Cottage in 1804 when he wrote the poem, I don't know. I couldn't honestly say, but certainly in later years, absolutely. It's pretty wonderful, actually, isn't it?
Well, that's fantastic kind of embodiment of the themes of the course that we've been thinking about this week, and we'll continue to think about. So thank you very much indeed, Jeff, for sharing your time with us again, and for sharing Dove Cottage with us. Obviously, you're going to be present throughout the rest of the course. Next week, when we're looking at the prelude, I'm going to be talking to Sally, and then hopefully you'll be able to join us in week 3 and 4 for further discussion.
It's wonderful to be part of this. And these questions, they're really thought-provoking. It's been a really great pleasure thinking through them.
Great. Well, thank you again, Jeff, and thank you to everybody who's been involved in the course so far, including the educators, our 2 excellent mentors, the people who give us support in terms of the computer systems and so on. And obviously, particular thanks to everyone who's engaging with the course and who is sending in the comments. If there's anything you'd particularly like us to address in these end of week films, well, then we're very happy to do so. So do put those in your comments too. We hope you enjoy the start of next week's part of the course, when we'll be looking at the prelude, which we've talked about quite a lot and we look forward to seeing you again for the film there. In the meantime, have a very good week, and thank you again, Jeff.